My parents left my college graduation 20 minutes early to make it home for my brother's fantasy football draft. A month later, they asked me to invest $10,000 in his new business. My name is Sophia Reyes. I'm 27, and I work as a software engineer in Seattle. This is the story of the day I watched my parents choose a fantasy football league over watching me walk across a stage, and what happened when they asked me to fund my brother's next failure. I graduated with my master's degree in computer science after 6 demanding years of school, working part-time throughout to help cover costs since my parents' finances had always been stretched thin, largely because of how consistently they bailed out my older brother Tommy's various failed ventures over the years. My parents, Carmen and Hector, drove 3 hours to attend my graduation ceremony, which I appreciated genuinely, especially given how proud I felt finally reaching that milestone after years of exhausting work. The ceremony itself ran long, as these things do, with hundreds of names called across 2 hours, my name coming roughly 2/3 of the way through the alphabetical order. About 20 minutes before my name was called, my mother leaned over and told me quietly that she and my father needed to leave a little early. That Tommy's fantasy football draft started at a specific time that evening, and Tommy had asked them to be there in person for it, since apparently it had become a whole tradition among his friend group with snacks and a whiteboard for tracking pics. I sat there in my cap and gown, genuinely unsure I'd heard her correctly. My master's degree ceremony, 6 years of work, and my parents were leaving before my name was even called so they could get home in time for my brother's fantasy football draft. I didn't argue with her in the moment, too stunned and not wanting to make a scene during the ceremony itself. My parents left quietly about 15 minutes before my name was announced, and I walked across that stage, looked out at the audience, and saw 2 empty seats where they'd been sitting. My roommate Jasmine, who'd come to support me, met me afterward with a hug and a bouquet of flowers, filling the role my parents should have filled, taking photos with me in front of the university sign, treating the moment with the significance it deserved. I called my mother that evening, once the initial shock had settled into something closer to a quiet, simmering hurt. She answered sounding distracted, football commentary audible in the background. And when I mentioned that I'd noticed them leaving before my name was called, she said somewhat dismissively that they'd seen plenty of the ceremony, that graduations were mostly just sitting through names anyway, and that Tommy had really been looking forward to having them there for his draft. I didn't push further that night, still processing, still trying to reconcile the ceremony I'd just experienced with the pattern I was slowly starting to see more clearly, a pattern where Tommy's interests, however minor, consistently outweighed mine, however significant. About a month later, my parents called together, on speakerphone, sounding excited about something. Tommy had an idea for a business, some kind of specialty food delivery service he'd been developing with a friend, and he needed startup capital to get it off the ground. My parents explained that they'd already committed what savings they could, but it wasn't enough, and they wondered if I might be willing to invest $10,000, given my stable engineering salary, to help give Tommy this opportunity. I should mention, for context, that this would have been Tommy's 4th business venture in 6 years, following a failed car detailing service, a failed clothing brand, and a failed personal training certification business. Each one funded partially by our parents dipping into savings they could barely afford to dip into, none of them ever generating meaningful income before quietly dissolving. "You left my graduation early for his fantasy football draft," I said. "And now you want me to give him $10,000, my father, who rarely spoke much during these conversations, said, somewhat defensively, that the graduation thing wasn't fair to bring up, that it was unrelated to Tommy's business opportunity, and that I should think of this as an investment in family, not just in Tommy specifically. It's directly related," I said. "You've spent years prioritizing Tommy's interests over mine, in small ways and big ways. And now you're asking me to fund his 4th failed business idea with money I worked incredibly hard to earn." My mother tried a softer approach, saying that Tommy had really grown from his previous failures, that this idea felt different, more promising, and that families should support each other during opportunities like this. I told her I didn't believe the $10,000 would be treated any differently than the previous investments had been, and that I wasn't willing to risk it. The conversation ended tensely, my parents clearly disappointed, though I noticed neither of them apologized for the graduation incident even as the topic sat directly in the middle of our conversation. It simply hung there, acknowledged but never actually addressed. Tommy called me a few days later, upset, having apparently heard from our parents that I'd refused to help. He accused me of always thinking I was better than him since I'd gone to graduate school, of never supporting his dreams the way a sibling should, completely sidestepping the actual substance of my hesitation, which had far more to do with a consistent pattern of failed investments than with any judgment about his character. I told Tommy plainly that I'd love to see him succeed genuinely, but that I wasn't willing to fund another venture without seeing something concrete. A business plan, financial projections, anything beyond enthusiasm and a friend with a similar idea. He didn't respond well to that, and our relationship remained cold for several months afterward. The business predictably folded within 8 months, having burned through my parents' contribution along with a small loan Tommy had taken out himself. I didn't say I told you so, though the temptation existed, and instead simply let the outcome speak for itself. My relationship with my parents has settled into something more measured since then. I still see them regularly, still love them, but I no longer assume my achievements will receive the same weight in their eyes that Tommy's interests seem to automatically receive. I've stopped expecting equal treatment and started simply protecting my own resources and time more carefully, since it became clear that expecting reciprocity wasn't going to change a pattern that had existed my entire life. I think about that graduation sometimes, the 2 empty seats, walking across the stage without my parents watching. It taught me something important about the difference between people who show up for your big moments and people who show up when it's convenient, when nothing more interesting is competing for their attention. I've learned to notice that difference now, in all my relationships, and to weigh accordingly what I'm willing to give people who've already shown me clearly what they prioritize.